Hello everyone, my name is Lisa Young. I'm the Clean Energy Organizer for the Snake River Alliance, and I dabble a little bit in our nuclear program, so tonight I'm going to be touching on that. I'm so pleased that all of you are here. The volunteer team that is put together this evening has worked really hard. It's awesome to see all of you turn out, and I appreciate Joanna coming to Boise, a very rare and exciting opportunity, and I am honored to share this space with her tonight. So thank you so much for coming. And what I'm going to do right now is give you a little taste of how the nuclear fuel chain works, and where the fuel comes from and where it goes after it's done being used. And this will help you, I think, when you're trying to understand Joanna's work and a lot of the things that we're talking about in that context, and the Snake River Alliance's work, and what we do, and what parts of the nuclear fuel chain we interact with, and what parts we really need to be paying attention to, which is pretty much every part. So, all right. So, and just as a note, I have a background in chemistry. I graduated from BSU just a couple years ago, but I'm so happy to be working with the Snake River Alliance to do community organizing and really utilize my science background to make a true difference in the community, which is exactly what the Snake River Alliance does. So hopefully this is an example of that. And I'm just going to be cueing you for slides. So our focus tonight is on nuclear power, and we're going to be touching on nuclear weapons as well. Excellent. So the question is, why do we even need to learn about the nuclear fuel cycle, even when we're focusing on this topic? And the truth is, as Joanna just said, it's important for us to know probably about every natural resource cycle, where things come from and where they go when we dispose of them after they're done. A lot of things we obtain, we get at the store, and don't necessarily know about what happens before and after, and that's really problematic because of all the concerning activities and processes that take place in those times. So with the nuclear fuel chain, a lot of times we know maybe what happens at the reactor, but we're not sure about the process and before and after. And this is really important because we have over 450 nuclear reactors in the world. There's 104 of them in the United States alone. That's in over 30 countries. And so we really do need to understand the behind the scenes of how nuclear power is made and what this fuel is all about. And maybe many of you may not know all the steps that are involved, all the transportation processes, all the facilities, all the maintenance that's involved in this fuel chain overall, and how extensive and complex and expensive and dangerous and toxic it is. And finally, one reason why we really need to understand the nuclear fuel chain in particular, out of all the fuel chains that exist in the world and natural resource cycles, is because of the material that we're dealing with. This is a highly toxic and highly radioactive material. And there are other fuel cycles that involve some radioactivity, but nuclear fuel is the most radioactive stuff you can get out there. And this poses a huge environmental risk and certainly a public health threat when you consider all the dangers that radiation can do to your body, your cells, changing your DNA so that it causes mutations and causes cancers and illnesses, birth defects. This is very serious material that we're dealing with, and this is all to produce electricity, so it's good for us to know exactly where it comes from and how we can avoid getting into contact with it. So I'm going to really briefly go over how nuclear power works, because I think it's important as we're going through the process of the fuel chain that you know what the fuel is being used for. So the first step is starts in the reactor vessel, and we'll see if my bullet point comes up. Okay, excellent. So in that reactor vessel, you're going to have the material, the fuel that you need to create the reaction. And what happens is we split uranium atoms in half. And if I could get the next slide. This is just a picture of what that might look like. You've got that uranium atom, a bunch of those in the core, and a neutron hits that atom. It splits it into two new atoms. So you started with one radioactive element, and now you have two. And then that process produces a bunch of energy, tons of heat, and it also produces more neutrons. So those neutrons spew off, go find more uranium nuclei to split, and the process continues. It's a chain reaction. And every time those atoms split, you get a bunch of energy and a bunch of heat. So next slide, please. The reason why we want all that heat is because we want to boil water. Next slide. And when we boil the water, it turns into steam. The steam, moving, spins a turbine. That turbine spins a generator, and we have electricity that powers our homes and our businesses and our world. So essentially, next slide, we are we are splitting atoms, creating radioactive material in order to boil water. So the question really in this process is, where does that uranium come from? And where do those byproducts go, those extra atoms that we made through this process? And that's what we're going to explore right now, is this nuclear fuel chain from cradle to grave. And there's 10 different steps that I've segregated: uranium mining, milling, converting, enriching, deconverting, fabricating, using, cooling, storing, and disposing. Pretty simple. Not really. So what I'm going to do is go through each of these processes and just give you an idea about kind of the impacts that they each individually have on the waste that's produced at each step, and how really icky and ugly every single step of this process is. So we start with mining. And the uranium comes from the earth. We have to find those uranium deposits around the world, and you can mine it underground, or you can create a big open pit and mine it from the surface. But no matter what you're doing, you're releasing radioactive material into the atmosphere, into the water, into circulation in our world. And the main thing that you might be releasing is radon gas, radioactive particles, other radioactive gases. And not only does that have a huge impact on the workers that work on those mines, but also the communities that are nearby, which are often indigenous. And so all these particles and these materials are going into the air and spreading widely and affecting communities all over. And the other way that you can do it, we'll stay on that slide if we can. The other way you can do it is by in situ recovery, which is when you take water and a bunch of icky chemicals and you pump them down into the earth to dissolve the ore, and then you pull that slurry back up and remove the uranium out of there. No matter what you're doing, it's not healthy. And turns out that all of this work that you're doing, all the energy and all the time, and all this material that you're pulling out of the planet, less than 1% of that actually contains any uranium at all. So you're taking all of this stuff out of the planet, and you only want even less than 1% of that. So then the next step is we have to take all that ore and mill it and somehow get that uranium out of there. So in this process, you grind it, crush it, treat it with a bunch of nasty chemicals, and it creates a bunch of chemical waste in and of itself. If you can move the next slide. And this process gives you, after you dry it and filter it, you get yellow cake, this yellow powdery stuff over here. And that, now we have concentrated uranium. 7 to 90% of that now has the uranium that we need to move forward. But in this process, again, you're getting rid of all the extra stuff that you had to mine. That's creating mill tailings and tailings ponds, and these ponds full of chemicals and the extra rock that you don't need. And a lot of heavy metals are in that process, all the chemicals and the acids and bases that you use to extract that uranium. And then also dangerous radioactive materials like thorium-230. And again, those tailing ponds and those piles pretty much just sit next to the milling facilities and just sit there, and they'll be there till the end of time. The next step is to convert that yellow cake into a new form, and that's the uranium hexafluoride. So this is a white solid, and the neat thing about uranium hexafluoride is that if you just heat it up a little bit, it starts to turn into a gas. So if you've ever been to a Halloween party and someone's got, what's that called? Dry ice, thank you. Dry ice, and you've got the solid mass of ice turning into gas. That's exactly what this stuff does if you heat it up a little bit. And we'll see why that's useful in the next step. But in order to get it into that phase, you have to do all these chemical reaction things, a bunch of solvents, a bunch of acids, bases, really expensive gases that you have to use in order to do those conversions. It creates a bunch of waste, and all that waste is now contaminated with radioactive materials as well. Disposing of that is not easy. And what happens in the next step, if you go to the next slide, is that we then enrich that material. So now that it's in the gaseous form, we can do something called gas centrifuge technology. And what we do is put that material in the gas centrifuges and spin it really, really fast. And it needs to be in the gaseous form. That's why we did the last step. And what happens is you're able to kind of concentrate and separate out two types of uranium atoms that exist. We're going to go to the next slide. If you remember the little uranium atom from the very, very first beginning of the presentation, there's two types of nuclei that look like that. And one of them just has 3 more particles inside of it. So one of them has 235 particles, and one of them has 238 particles. And it turns out the vast majority of the uranium atoms that exist in the world, all those ones that you dug up, 99% of those atoms are the heavier one, the U-238. But the ones we need for nuclear power are U-235. Those are the only ones that work in a nuclear reactor. So you just took all this energy and time digging up all this uranium, but 99% of it is useless. So less than 1% is actually the stuff that we need. So what happens in these centrifuges is that you spin off some of that bad stuff that you don't want and try to concentrate the U-235 so that you can have an efficient reaction in the nuclear reactor. What you get when you spin all that stuff off is that excess U-238, and that's called depleted uranium waste. This is a really nasty material. It's extremely radioactive and highly toxic, highly reactive with water, and when it reacts with water, it forms hydrofluoric acid and a uranyl fluoride compound that are really toxic, soluble, corrosive. And what do? We put them in barrels that are susceptible to corrosion. And we put them on concrete pads outside of our facilities and just let them sit. This is the facility that's being proposed in Idaho to produce this waste. And every time you produce 1 ton of the useful material to go on to the nuclear reaction, you produce 7 times that amount of waste. So 7-to-1 ratio. And it turns out this technology is also used to make nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. So after that, after we've enriched the material, the nuclear industry, we have to deconvert it. No, I said it again. I don't do this work. Trust me. The nuclear industry has to deconvert the material and turn it back into a solid because we don't want it to be a gas anymore. I'm just going to keep saying that. And that involves a bunch of other chemical steps, much more waste, much more high temperature, high energy processes in order to get it to this black powder. Now we're ready to make nuclear fuel rods. This is the fabricating part. So you take that black powder and turn it into ceramic pellets with high temperature furnace, put them into zirconium rods 10 to 12 feet long, and then you take all those rods and bundle them up together, and take those bundles and bundle them up together, and what we've got in the end is a core of a nuclear reactor. Next. So now those fuel rods are ready to use. And when you put them inside that reactor vessel, we're doing what I showed you at the very beginning. Those atoms are going to be fizzing, splitting inside of the reactor core, heating up that water in order to spin the turbine, in order to create the electricity. And again, in this process, we're taking a single radioactive atom and splitting it up into 2 radioactive atoms, highly radioactive, all over the periodic table, a variety of different things that we're creating in this process. And so, in the end, after 3 to 5 years or so of reacting in the reactor core, they're no longer efficient, which is interesting because you've only used 4% of the uranium. But in that process, you've created dangerous, toxic material. And this is the waste that's produced. So once you have this really dangerous material that's going to be toxic and radioactive for the next 100,000 million or so years, you have to cool it down because it's really, really hot and extremely, it has a lot of radiation coming off of it. So the first thing they do is stick it in these really deep pools, big swimming pools. And that cools them down for at least 3 to 5 years. They're required to be in there for that long because they're so hot. And the water and the air quality in these places is highly monitored. You have to be really careful that no reactions happen that you don't want to happen. Spend a lot of energy and pressure making these places safe. And we saw that these kind of places can be very vulnerable, particularly in the Fukushima reaction when the water boiled off and the fuel rods melted. So this water, keeping it cool and keeping those rods cool is very important. But after a few years, they are allowed to go into dry storage. And so you put them in these big steel casks, fill them with an inert gas so they don't react with the air. Then put that steel container in a cement container and make sure that nothing happens there. And there's about 10 metric tons of waste in each one of these casks. You can see how big they are. And they continue to cool passively. There's still a lot of radiation being given off this point in time. But the containment keeps it fairly contained as long as it stays in the containment. As long as there's no earthquake, as long as there's no war. So they're pretty vulnerable if you think about it that way. And the industry in the world is using those places as only interim storage. So the intent is not to keep them there forever. The intent is to build an underground cavern. That's where we're going to put all of our nuclear waste. And right now there's none that are even built in this world yet. One is under construction. It's going to take a couple centuries to build.